as we go through
Shramana, we
today.
are going live now. It says we are going live now. Shramana.
Um, Good evening, everyone. I am Shramana Biswas, and I welcome you all to this panel discussion on cultural identity and ideology, curated under TMYS review in association with Oxford University Press. Under this theme, TMYS review December 2022 will explore the role of artistic endeavors of society in shaping cultural identity and ideology. I would also like to say that we are calling for submissions and stories, essays and poems, and for project architecture and submission guidelines, please visit www.tellmeyourstory.biz. Today's topic of discussion is theatrical performances, drama across spaces and regions. We are honored to have with us Dr. Anita Singh, Dr. Glenn Odom, and Dr. Sukanya Chakrabarti, as our esteemed speakers for the panel. Thank you so much for joining us. I shall now quickly introduce our speakers. Dr. Anita Singh is a professor in the Department of English at Banaras Hindu University, Varanasi, India. She received Fulbright Nehru Visiting Scholar Fellowship in the year 2013 to 2014 at the University of Virginia, USA. She was a fellow at the Indian Institute of Advanced Study in Shimla, India from 2018 to 2020. Her recent publications are Staging Feminisms, Gender Violence and Performance, and the two edited volumes, Gender Space and Resistance, Women and Theatre in India, and Hero Worship, Fandom in Modern India. She has completed a major research project sanctioned by the Indian Council of Social Science Research on staging gender performing women in Ram Leela of Ramnagar. Dr. Singh has published interviews with Indian women performers in the Asian Theatre Journal and contributed to 4 chapters in the Routledge Handbook of Asian Theatre, and was the guest editor for the special issue of the journal Gender Issues. She has also served as the conference chair for the Future of Women conference held in Malaysia, Colombo, and Bangalore, and is the president of the Asian African Association of Women, Gender, and Sexuality. Dr. Glenn Odom is a reader at Roehampton University. He is currently completing research on intercultural theatre and a more global understanding of globalization. His books, World Theories of Theatre and Yoruba Performance, Theatre and Politics, Staging Resistance, and his articles in Asian Theatre Journal, Comparative Drama, TDR, the Journal of Dramatic Theory and Criticism, and Comparative Literature, explores theories and practices of theatre and performance across Europe, Asia, and Africa. Dr. Odom received his BA and MA from Vanderbilt University and his MA and PhD from University of California, Irvine. Dr. Sukanya Chakrabarti is an artist scholar and associate professor at the Department of Film and Theatre, San Jose State University. She received her doctoral degree in theatre and performance studies from Stanford University and previously worked at Florida State University and San Francisco State University. Dr. Chakrabarti has been the recipient of several grants and awards, such as the RSCA Recovery Research Award, Marcus Early Career Research Award, LCA Extraordinary Ideas Grant, Student Success in the Major Grant, and the Facilities of Arts Research Fellowship. Dr. Chakrabarti's works have been published in peer-reviewed journals such as Indian Theatre Journal, Asian Theatre Journal, Modern Drama, Urban Geography, Ecumenica, Performance and Religion, Asiatic, IIUM Journal of English Language and Literature, and Emergency Index. She recently published a chapter, Go Back to India If You Hate My People So Much, Consequences of Troubling and Reimagining of the Canon in American Academia in Troubling Traditions, Canonicity, Theatre and Performance. Her upcoming research monograph, In Between Worlds, Performing as Bowls in an Age of Extremism, is currently in production with Routledge. Dr. Chakraborty's performance, practice, scholarship, and teaching lie in the intersection of post colonial studies, globalization studies, and urban studies, with a focus on South Asian theatre and performance studies, transcultural theatre and performance, experimental device performance, and community based performance making. Now, without further delay, we shall start with today's session. Dr. Anita Singh, I request you to please present your views on today's topic. Over to you, ma'am.
Thank you so much, Shramana, for introducing us all. And hello, everyone, and hello to the panelists as well, and the moderator. So, what I'm going to speak on is what Shramana introduced me as. Like, I've done a major research project, and I chose this because this is the time of the festival of what we call the Ram Leela, that is the Ram's festival and so on. So this Ramlila is a popular living tradition, and as I said, that it's being performed now. It is performed every year for almost 31 days during this month, and it ends with, of course, the Dashera, the burning of the effigies of Ravana, and it is a very popular, folk performance, and popular to the extent that all the 31 days there are almost 20,000 spectators who come to see each of the episodes. And it is, one would say, it is an improvisatory, site specific environment theater. And the story of this Ram Leela is based on the sacred epic Ramayana, which is said to be originally written in Sanskrit by Valmiki. One school believes that Valmiki's Ramayana is the authoritative text. Of course, there are so many other schools, like Paula Richmond talks about many Ramayana, so does Ramanujan, and so on. And subsequently, in the 16th century, Tulsidas democratized the Sanskrit Ramayana by rewriting it in Avdi dialect. And also, he initiated the whole tradition of the performance practice of Ramayana. Uh, Philip Ludgendorff says that this effort of Tulsidas was kind of an assertion of an Indian identity, or one, so to say, a Hindu identity at a time of the Muslim invasion in around 16th century. Now, moving forward to the pre-colonial times, the Rajas and the Maharajas of Varanasi. Varanasi is in the northern part of India, and it was quite an important area as far as the freedom movement was concerned. So the then Maharajas started the practice of Ram Leela. And uh, in 1930, a Raja called Udit Narayan, he started this practice. And another Maharaja, he commissioned several writers and poets to write the Ramayana, Ramcharitramanas, not in Avdi, because Avdi wouldn't have been understood by the people now. The language is very different. So he rewrote it in Hindi language. And from then on became the practice of the performance of Ram Leela. So then for the Maharajas, this Ram Leela became a kind of an assertion of an identity, or an assertion of a pre-independence Indian identity, culture, and assertion of. So in a way, one would say that this performance inherits the politics of culture, identity, and nation at a time when India was colonized, and these Rajas and the Maharajas were struggling against the colonial rule. So that this becomes the context of the Ram Leela. Now, if you look at the practice of Ram Leela, as I said, it goes on for 31 days. And this is a very peculiar, practice. There are so many Ram Leelas performed all over the country. But this small town of Ramnagar has a very peculiar way of presenting Ram Leela that has excited the interest of scholars such as Richard Sechner, who has stayed here and researched and written extensively, Philip Ludgendorff, and Anuradha Kapoor, to name just a few. Now, this, as I said, this performance goes on for 21 days, and it happens across the 25 kilometers of the radius of this small town called Ramnagar. Ramnagar literally translates as Ram's town, and if you look at the geography of the town, The entire town is named after the events that take place in Ramayana. That is the performance practice of Ram Leela. So, if there is an episode that is to happen at Ashok Vatika, so and the entire audience and the actors, they would move to that particular location, and so the entire place, one would say, is transformed geography during these 31 days. And even otherwise, if you go, you will find these places existing. These places are known by the names of Ashok Vatika, Kishkinda. These are places, these are locations in Ramlila. And even the place where I stay, it is called Lanka. Lanka is so the kind of Varanasi is across the river. So it was said that Ram, uh, while he went to defeat, confront Ravana, who had abducted his wife Sita, he goes to Lanka. So Lanka happens to be across the river. That is where he defeats, Ravana and so on, and bring back his wife and so on. Now the entire performance is a semi-rural, very unsophisticated kind of a performance. So it is structured in three ways. The first is the Ramayanis. The Ramayanis are a group of around 12 people who carry the Ramcharitramanas in their hands and sit on a slightly perched, elevated stage. So there, and from there they keep reading every episode of the Ramcharitramanas that is to be performed on a lower stage. So the function of the Ramayani is that they read out from the original text, and even the spectators carry Ramayana with this Ramcharitramanas with them. I have seen, the villagers in the bicycle having their Ramcharitramanas at the back, and they would perch their bicycle anywhere that they want, wherever they get a good view of the stage and the Ramayani sitting on top, and they'll open the specific episode and start reading along with the Ramayanis. So this becomes a very participatory kind of a religious ritual festival also. Then you have the other structure, the other layer, that is the samvad. Samvad literally translates as dialogue. Now, dialogue is delivered by the characters, the actors, so to say. And these actors are not called actors, they are called swaroop. Swaroop means likeness, because they are playing characters of the epic, a religious epic, a sacred epic. So they are these characters, the actors are called swaroop, like like Ram, like Sita, and so on. Now, these Swaroops are all actually young boys between the age of 8 to 13, and they're all boys. So, the caste and gender restrictions are very strictly, hierarchies are very strictly maintained. All the boys that are selected for the performance of this Ramlila for the 31 days that it goes on, all boys are Brahmin boys. Now, Brahmin is an upper caste in India. So, all are boys and all are Brahmins. So, caste and gender hierarchies, as I mentioned, are strictly maintained during the performance of the play, even in the 21st century. So, what has happened with this tradition is, whatever the tradition that started in 1830 has been followed very religiously, as far as the performance practice is concerned, as far as the lighting is concerned. There are no artificial or electric lights. There are Petromax lamps all over, strewn all over the area. There are no microphones. So these characters have to literally shout out their dialogues and so on. And so this is the second layer. The third layer is the what is called the effigies, the spectacle, the jhaki. And so this is how the entire episode is structured. And every day the play begins with puja. So every day the play begins somewhere around 6 p.m. and ends by 10 p.m. And it begins with the puja. The Maharaja in his elephant comes and he washes the feet of the performers, that is Ram, Lakshman, and Sita. And that is how the play begins. And every day the play ends with an arti. Arti is like seeking giving blessings to everyone and so on. So again, as I said, emphasize the religious aspect of this performance, the hugely popular performance practice. Now, if you look at the plot typology, so it is a typical plot of this brave Ram rescuing Sita, who's been abducted, and ultimately restoring order to his kingdom. So Ram becomes the active principle, the Maryada Purushottam, the able man who is capable of Swaraj, self-rule, who is capable of bringing in Dharmaraj, who is capable of restoring law, order, peace, and ethics and dharma in this world. Again, as I said, we need to keep in mind the colonial rule and how Indians were looking at for and all decolonizing the kind of the colonial rule and the power. So they were asserting that Indian already had a tradition of Dharam Yog and Dharam Raj and so on. So by showcasing Ram Leela, it becomes an important device to convey that we are capable and we already had a long tradition of such kind of a practices. Now the female characters, if we look at them, Sita becomes a passive principle, and very often in the play she refers to Ram as Swami, Pran Nath, and Maharaja. So always Ram in the play is shown to be in a superior position and Sita in a subordinate position. One very important character in the play is Shupnakha. Shupnakha is Ravana's sister whose nose is cut off, and when this episode is performed, it is called Nak Kataya, cutting off the nose. So there's a lot of fun and frolic and laughter and merriment. It's not a sad episode; it's just a fun episode, and people rejoice and so on. Now, the character of Shupnakha is not played by any of these boys. It's played by a dancing girl in the village. And while I was researching, so this entire project was based on my research in the year 2014-15. This was a project granted to me by Indian Council of Social Science Research. Subsequently, the findings of this research was published in a journal called Samyukta, a journal of gender and culture. So this show, nobody wants to perform the character of the Supnaka. So when I asked them who does it then, so they say that it's a dancing girl and she's been doing it for the last 20 years or so. And interestingly, and interestingly, she's the highest paid actor in the entire Ram Leela. She's paid somewhere around 500 rupees per day, whereas others are paid a paltry sum of 20 to 30 rupees or maybe 50 rupees. I don't know if they've increased now. But the important thing is that it is both a Leela and a Mela. There are a lot of fun, merriment, shops, and so on. It's sacred and secular. So it brings together, and when the Ram Leela happens, the invocation is to Ram to Shiva. So they begin with Jai Shri Ram. They start off with Har Har Mahadev and also Maharaj Ki Jai, the king. So there are two gods and a king who are invoked at the beginning and the end of each performance. So I hope I haven't taken up much time. I'm ready to, Shramana, is my time up? It's okay. So
Uh,
I'm ready to answer questions if need be. Yeah.
Ma'am, the Q&A session will take place after all of the panelists
Fine,
have.
fine. Yes. So can I
Uh,
just end with one more statement?
yes, yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am,
So,
definitely.
so the Ram Leela, the play, the performance, which is hugely popular and caters to the masses, literate and illiterate alike. Now the play ends with Ram being restored on the throne, and he is an able ruler, and we now have Ram Rajya. But Ramayana goes much beyond that. So when I questioned them, I said, "Why is that? What about Sita? Why don't you enact a part?" They said that no, fine. We are only concerned with this is what it is all about. It's the story of Ram. No, Sita is like forgotten, insignificant, not really important. And we know the travels that Sita had faced. But the story that is popularized, that is valorized, that is circulated is about Ram. And that's what it is all about. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, ma'am. This presentation was very engrossing, especially your detailed analysis of Ram Leela, and especially when you said that it played an important role in asserting that pre-independence Indian identity uh, uh, during an era, especially like during that time when British theatre, like they only housed plays that fulfilled that English criteria. So thank you so much, ma'am. I would invite Dr. Glenn Odom, sir. Can you please uh, give your talk now?
Yes, I apologize for the bad camera angles. I'm not in the ideal setup, so I'm going to be looking away from you for most of this talk. So what interested me about this topic, part of why I agreed to do it, was the notion of ideology that allows us to move fluidly between all sorts of different examples. There was a moment when I might have been speaking about Brazil, when we might have... So how do we move in between things? And my research is about theater as a point of contact, as a contact zone. And so I'm going to actually talk about a few specific examples, but also about a technique and a method of interacting with theater, of thinking about theater. And that begins with my research in Nigeria when I was still a PhD student working with Yoruba performance. I went in with a series of questions that were firmly grounded in social anthropology and mixed with post-colonial studies. And I was very quickly given a nickname by the performers, basically the guy who asked weird questions. They did not find my questions appropriate or relevant to their context. And this set me on a mission that has sort of shaped my professional career to challenge the over-application of any and all theoretical frameworks that emerge within the Anglo and European discursive spaces. So to the idea that theory is also a local phenomenon, just as are other phenomenon, and there's not a theory that is truly global. While many theories reach across the globe, they're all specific. So the first part of this mission is convincing people that we're not already doing this. There's a confusion between theorizing about the global East and South and actual utilization of theories from the global East and South as core methodologies. While most every scholar in, say, Japan has read almost everything emerging from the US in their given field, the reverse is not true. There's sort of a scholarly gap in what is read and where it's read. So there are an abundance of English language translated or published plays and many published studies on other modes of performance across the Asian and East Asian and African context. Less so from the Middle East, but that's emerging. And there are gaps in what is published and what isn't in terms of the artistic content, particularly within marginalized communities. But these absences are for the most part recognized, and we're working to adjust them. What's not readily available is a matching set of critical frameworks from these many countries and regions. My book, World Theories of Theater, contains a few new translations and of newer theories, and a few reprints of some of the canonical theories emerging from these contexts. And the publisher required that I explain each of these in terms of more familiar Western figures. I rejected this and instead used these theories to provincialize Western theory. So an example, Yale Farber's Malara, which is a South African adaptation of the Oresteia that's set up against the backdrop of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Traditionally, in sort of the discursive field that I was trained in, we might begin by analyzing this in terms of intercultural theater, or we might take a comparative approach. Immediately, this generates problems. The term intercultural just doesn't have coinage in South Africa. Athol Williams' bumper car model of cultural interaction, official discourses of the Rainbow Nation, or notions of synchronic performance and loud rejections of synchronic performance. These are parts of the discursive context in which the play is positioned. I'd go so far as to say that it is not intercultural, because intercultural is not a neutral term. It's a term loaded by decades of scholarly baggage. The notion of juxtaposition or foldedness, the idea that you can find, I guess my hands are visible over here, the idea that you can find identities of something between seeing what they're next to and looking at the seams between those connections, rather than the idea of blendedness. This is more salient to South African scholarship, and as are resistances to that notion of foldedness. Unlike Pavi's Hourglass, then, in which there's an original culture and then things get translated through to a target audience, In the case of Yael Farber's work, her play Malara, there are two, or in this case, many different cultures, all of which are visible at once. Rather than assuming the universality of the Greek text and the issues presented therein, which is a common move in the part of intercultural theater studies, or questioning what is translated and what is not translated, which would be a sort of standard move in post-colonial theory, thinking about translation and thinking about articulation of new ideas. Our starting question for Malara, if we look at it from a context of South African theoretical discourses, might be what cultures are visibly juxtaposed. In this case, the juxtaposition in that play is between a retributive notion of justice and a restorative notion of justice. So the idea of revenge, which is common in Greek tragedies, and the idea of restoration, which is, of course, the foundation of the TRC. This juxtaposition can then be read against the background of protest plays in South Africa, which in turn raises a question about the nature of realism, as the realism of the protest plays in South Africa is quite different than other notions of realism and is a hotly contested piece in South African scholarship. So I should say here that much of what's published in South Africa or by South African scholars abroad characterizes itself as universal. But this is a universal that takes South Africa as a starting point and incorporates the rest of the world into it. It's a more self-aware, self-consciously introspective universal than its Western counterpart, and a more outwardly facing universal than its Chinese counterpart. That is to say, South African scholarship is no more or less provincial than the scholarship emerging from the UK. It's no more or less limited, and indeed no more or less limiting than this scholarship. It is, however, for all its overlap and exchange, still radically specific. To shift to a different theatrical example that invokes the concept of space from the title of today, there's a Japanese play called The Attic that takes place almost entirely within a very small box, with barely room for two people to sort of crouch next to each other. This is obviously a comment on the shut-in phenomenon in Tokyo, in contemporary Tokyo, but one of its vignettes also takes us to Anne Frank's Attic. So there's some commentary on the phenomenon of confinement or hiding more broadly. As my students quickly deduced when performing this play via Zoom during lockdown, space and our ability to move through it is something that we must intellectually and physically negotiate as part of the process of being human. Existing in space is a shared human condition. While one could certainly pick up this discussion in terms of all the work done on migrancy and mobility across various types of anthropology, human geography, cultural studies, literary studies, or performance studies, I'd suggest that the results of these examinations would be substantially different from an examination that took something like Suzuki Tadashi's notion of the body as culture as a starting point. If bodies are trained to move in culturally specific ways, then what is this play saying that is specifically Japanese? Does the use of space relate instead to the rigid delineations of space, of stage space and corresponding psychomachia of no theater? What about the wartime philosophy and radical rejections of it later, surrounding the notions of a chained island? For that matter, given that I've just invoked the island, what happens if we consider this material in light of Kamua Braithwaite's theory of tidalectics, that the island itself shapes the text? The suggestion that one might apply a Caribbean theory of literature to Japanese theater should be no more or less shocking and require no more or less explanation than, say, an application of Foucault might. So what then is the common ground, the basis for discussion? How can we talk about a variety of different theaters together? Well, I think we must always start with a radically specific context and indeed figure out what context is the most relevant in a given situation, including highlighting the theoretical and philosophical grounds. How can these specific examinations grow together with one another? The theater and the regions where I've done most of my work all start from different philosophical premises, interact with other regions, and then produce discourses about related topics, even if the framing of these topics and questions pose very radically. Questions of modernity, the nature of the actor, the nature of identity, the nature of cultural contact, these are generally shared areas of concern, but they're never collapsible into a single discourse, a single set of questions, or even a single set of contested definitions. I imagine this interaction, the theater as a point of interaction, as a heteroglobal phenomenon, one that highlights differences even while recognizing the juxtaposition, overlap, and long-standing history of blending at work in theater around the world. Thank you.
Thank you so much, sir. Your presentation was it was very interesting, especially for me because I have not been acquainted with South African theater as such, but I believe that you have posed some very important questions like what should be translated and what cultures can be visibly juxtaposed, etc. Thank you so much, sir. Um, Next, I would request Dr. Sukanya Chakrabarti. Ma'am, please present your views on today's topic.
Sure. Thank you so much, Shramana, and thank you, Glenn and Dr. Singh and Dr. Odom. I should address you as. I realize that, what I'm going to talk about has a lot of overlaps with what has already been discussed. First of all, I think in reference to Dr. Singh's work, I feel like the site specificity and, the idea of the place playing an important role comes into my research. And I also think that in terms of Dr. Odom's work, I feel like this idea of kind of looking at the ontology of performance also, like, the idea of what makes a performance kind of a performance, or, and so my original my dissertation research was based on kind of looking at again, kind of looking at and troubling this kind of these terms such as the intercultural, the intracultural, and kind of looking at performance from a global perspective, but also like troubling what these notions are of the local and the global. And I kind of particularly look at bowl performances. So like, I come from West Bengal, so nothing can be more local for me than the bowls in terms of performance practices, but then kind of opening up and widening the lens. So like, my dissertation project was based on looking at the heterogeneity that the bowl performances kind of provide, or the heterogeneous landscapes or the sites that bowl performances provide. And in that, I kind of argue that there is a certain intersection of the spiritual and the political, and I kind of look at the politics of spirituality in a way. I look at the politics of space. And so, that led me to think about, the political potency of performances in a way. And, kind of that led me, and my research evolved into looking at space as a site of, investigation in a way that I look at the political meaning making that space provides. And kind of starting from the very notion that Marvin Carlson talks about, that, a city is a text. I look at how cities can become performances themselves and how cities perform. And in that, I kind of bring in the lens of choreography and how the state choreographs. And, so currently, what I'm going to talk about is I'll focus more, like, instead of going all over the place with, how my research has evolved and spanned over the years. I'm just going to talk very particularly about this recent paper I wrote about street theater, and which is, again, like, the birth of street theater is very obviously political, but also I think I look at the poesy of that. So I kind of do not separate the poetry from the politics, the art from the politics in a way. And very particularly, I look at Jananatya Mancha's theater. And they are a group for, those of us who are not familiar with them, they were a group that kind of formed out of IPTA, Indian People's Theatre Association, which was an organization which was like a cultural wing of the Communist Party of India, and it kind of formed around the 1940s, I believe. So and then it kind of broke into different parts. So IPTA came into being around the early 1940s, 1943. And, the first wing was in Bangalore, and then there were different wings in different cities, metropolitan cities. And as you can tell that, such anti-colonial and anti-imperial work in the theatre landscape had started even before, the official decolonization, in the sense, in the official freedom of India, which happened in 1947. So of course, even before that, there were protest theaters, and which were maybe not street theaters as such, but because of the British intervention of theatrical modes in colonies, a lot of critics argue that, this kind of division increased between rural and urban theatre because of the superimposition of British forms of theatre and the introduction of proscenium. So if we actually look at pre-colonial forms and then we kind of look at street theatrical forms, we see that there are a lot of similarities in terms of form and format, because there was a deliberate effort in the part of theatre workers to kind of revive some of the forms that they thought were untainted by colonialism, right? But again, we need to question that as well, right? Because we do know that pre-colonial theatre wasn't necessarily not fraught in power relations, etc. Right? So what I'm trying to say is that, right after independence, with this kind of independence, the official independence of India in 1947, there was this concerted effort to kind of look backwards, or to kind of find the roots, which again is a problematic endeavor. Dr. Erin Mee has written extensively about theatre of the roots movement, where a lot of these theatre workers around the 1950s, 60s, and 70s were kind of going back, or kind of making an endeavor to go back to the roots, and whatever that means. So in that kind of endeavor, they started looking towards rural theatre, because again, the argument was that urban theatre was too much involved in British theatre, in the kind of proscenium-like theatre with Shakespearean influences. And so to kind of decolonize theatre, one had to go back to rural forms. Girish Karnad is also like one of those leaders in the theatre landscape, who kind of protested in his own way. And I feel like I use the term protest theatre in a very kind of with a wide lens, because I do not necessarily think that in your face, like protest theatre is the only kind of protest theatre. I feel like a lot of these theatre makers were decolonizing in a very subtle manner, even through shifts in formatting, in shifts of staging practices. And I think when I talk about Janam, which was clearly like, very, they identify as a political group. They they were born of IPTA, which was a very political group. Of course, they were the cultural wing of CPIM. And then they kind of broke apart and became Jananatya Manch in the 1970s. They are very, very obviously political, but I also think that they have maintained a kind of poetic sensibility in that kind of juncture between like that audience and performer interaction, because there is the zone of magical improvisation, and that is what I feel is most political to me, because I feel like it kind of really goes against linear kind of storytelling or proscenium like structure, all of which were introduced by the British. Um, in a way, I think focusing on space as an active element in participating in the protest has been very exciting for me, because I look at the role of the space. And, kind of studying Janam's theater from the 1970s, you see how the theatrical space or the performance space is not a neutral space. It is an activated space. And the space is activated with a deliberate intent from the part of the performers. What is really a strong image for me, and which kind of really led me to look at Janam's theater, was this kind of resistance, of course, but also resilience. Like if we know the history of Sardar Hashmi, who was the leader of Jananaट्य Mancha in the 1970s, and his killing, his murder by uh, political goons, and it happened at the site of performance, when they had on January 1st 1989, when they were performing their political piece Halla Bol, again kind of protesting against labor conditions. And uh, so the the murder happened at the space, and within 3 days of the murder, Maula Ashri Hashmi, his wife, came back to that space to complete the performance, because that had been left, that had not been finished at that time because of the murder. So I find this kind of resistance and resilience very powerful and empowering to a large extent, because and the poetry in that kind of intent. So, Jananaट्य Mancha still kind of continues to do street theater, starting from the 1970s. And some of the plays, for example, Machine, which was their first street theater, was actually, again, a, a protest against this kind of oppressive corporate culture, and, protesting against the inhumane labor conditions. And the bodies of the actors formed a machine, and and they kind of create the space, they activate the space through creation of, or the choreography of bodies in space, but also how bodies come together and go apart, and kind of create this design of protest is very interesting to me. What really is compelling for me to look at street theater is the chance element, and how so much is left to chance, and so much of these chance elements become a part of the performance in a way, because they are usually, the performances are in open fields, in factories, in bus depots, in street intersections. And as you can tell, even through the form of choosing the space, there is an anti-colonial protest happening, because they're resisting this kind of corporatization of theater. They're resisting the hierarchical structure of theater that proscenium inherently is about, right? Like that kind of structure of the performers presenting to the audience being this kind of passive listener, and Janam actually actively going against that kind of formatting. And it is not new. I mean, again, 1970s protest theater, if we look at protest theater all across the world, it is not new to actually activate the street space or activate the city space, urban space, to have these protest theaters. And for example, I think, the very idea of protest theater, and again, Brecht in Germany was also like one of these big figures of kind of raising voice against authoritarian power, and through theater, and also activating the space in a way that kind of resists that kind of neat division between the actor and the audience. In a way, making the audience complicit and an equal participant in that kind of meaning making process. Even it can be considered to have taken and borrowed from the idea of Russian Revolution, kind of people coming into the streets and voicing their opinion. So the power of the common people in voicing their protest in the middle of street intersection kind of really speaks to the power of public space and energizing and activating of public space and what it can do. And a similar aesthetic was kind of borrowed by Janam and other theater artists from the 1970s in India and in Europe and in America, right? And in South Africa, like if you actually look at Athol Fugard and John Carney, Winston Chona, they're also, and they even got arrested for such street theater protests. And so we see that how form and content are kind of working hand in hand in order to make that meaning. Going back to Janam's kind of meaning making process by kind of breaking that division, I think there is they have a very good archive on their website, and you can actually see past performances. But this particular performance of Machine really speaks to me, where not only are the actors performing, but like external elements such as like a stray dog coming and like external sound elements, right? Like, because they are not in a controlled environment, but all contributing to what affect they want to produce. And that kind of really speaks to their kind democratization process of theater. We know that even Boal's techniques of kind of activating the spectator or the spectator is a very political process. And again, kind of going back to Janam and others, political theater artists in India in the 1970s, they were borrowing a lot of these techniques, and they were borrowing a lot from Brechtian techniques in terms of activating the space and activating the audience sensibilities. So refusing to accept the audience as passive recipients or consumers. So it kind of also goes against that kind of corporate structure making, right? Like, or ticketed performances, right? Like that profit making kind of profit generating machine that theater can become. They're resisting that idea. So kind of making it available to the common people. Initially, they moved, like IPTA or Janam actually moved to the streets because of lack of funds, because 1948, I believe, Communist Party was actually banned for a bit, and then they lost funding and they didn't have enough resources to put up plays on stages in auditoriums. And eventually they realized that even though it was out of compulsion that they moved to the streets, they realized the active potency of the street and of the space as generating meaning. And so they continued doing that. Eventually, they also kind of built a mobile stage, which they kind of would carry around to villages, to suburbs, and to bring theater to the people, again, kind of resisting that idea that theater is for the elite, right? Like theater is for those who can afford to watch, right? And so kind of resisting that idea to making it more accessible, more publicly available. And similarly, in Bengal, Badal Charkar was doing a lot of that, similar things like Angon performances, where like, courtyard performances. Utpal Datta was actually, he termed those street performances as street corner theater, like these were like found spaces, like erupting in different parts of the city. and and kind of looking at that poetic and political potential, that interaction, that kind of juncture between the audience and the performer, uh, generates that kind of energy, that kind of activating of consciousness. So returning to the site of Hashmi's murder to complete the performance of Halla Bol on January 4th, 1989, 2 days after Hashmi was attacked, continuing to perform an annual street theater at Sahibabad every 1st January subsequently, and continuing the work of political street theater even today, all could be seen as participating in that eternal regenerative cycle that Shombo Mitro actually identifies as Leela, and kind of again kind of overlapping somewhat with Dr. Singh's arguments about the Leela, and kind of spilling out into the space, a twilight magical spatial and temporal zone where politics, poetics, dissent, protest, humor, and storytelling collide and collate. A tumultuous space of questioning, of precarious balance between creative fulfillment and political purpose, between inward and outward, a poetic space nurtured and protected by those who walk the tightrope over and over again. And yeah, this is how I would like to conclude my portion.
Thank you so much, ma'am. It was a very engrossing speech. Like the historical journey that you told us about Janam, it was very interesting. And I believe that theatrical performance, like the emergence of a theatrical performance in any colonial state, it somehow transcends into looking for an identity. And this exploration, this act of exploration, or even that borrowing of theatrical tactics that you said, it actually goes to show how it helps in destabilizing any kind of hierarchy or hegemony that you said, be it colonial or imperialism or anything. Thank you so much, ma'am. Uh, so we shall now begin with our question answer session. So my first question is to Dr. Anita Singh. Ma'am, the theatrical performance is constantly shaped by interplay of setting, artist, and plot. It could be enjoyable or unsettling, concrete or metaphorical, true or distorted. Are the stage's physical space and its design meaning creating components throughout every theatrical production?
Space and the audience, right? So, of course, theater has a very important role to play as far as the audience is concerned. Uh, and Peter Brook, in his work, The Empty Space, he says, all you need for a theater activity to complete is a man walking in an empty space and someone is seeing him. That's all that you need. But you need somebody to see him. Tansen, while one of the gems of Akbar's court, he said that the performance is as good as the spectator. The spectator has to be good in order to get the best of the performance. Even as teachers, we have seen, the best of students get the best out of us. And also, there was this Birju Maharaj. He's a dancer. So once he went to an auditorium, and he saw that the organizers had darkened the auditorium. So he said that no, I want lights in the auditorium. I want to see the prekshak. I want to see the spectator. I want to see the prekshakar. I want to get prerna for them. I get inspiration when I see the performers. And what Erica Fisher-Lish also says, that there is an auto-poetic feedback loop with the performers and the audience. So it is not an isolated thing. It is all very interconnected. The performance space, the audience, and the actors. Yeah.
Thank you so much, ma'am. Thank you for the answer. My next question is to Dr. Glenn Odom. Sir, analyzing social behavior, organized movement, and verbal expression in rituals and socio-political significance are all aspects of cultural approaches to performance. how might we conceive the link across performance and ritual by considering the relationship between text and performance? Sir, you're muted, sir.
I'm muted. Yes. And now I'm unmuted. Apologies. I knew I was going to forget to do that. I want to start first by taking a very small detour and saying I wish now I'd chosen Yale Farber's Ram, which is actually an adaptation of the same story set against a background of protesting the strike of the garbage workers in South Africa, the sort of the waste strikes in South Africa, which intersects really interestingly with both of your work. But that is for another time when I rewrite this and we do it again. So in terms of your question, I think the boundaries of ritual, text, and performance and the significance of these terms, as I think all three of us have indicated, shift fairly radically in context. So the performance studies movement from NYU that left an indelible mark on UK scholars is one, but I reject that its heuristics apply equally well in all contexts. So I'd start by questioning the terms of performance, what counts as a text. And so I'd approach the above in a context by context way, asking the question of what is the context of this communication or performance first off. And I'd look for what the participants imagine to be the vital context. I wouldn't add or subtract from that context being context specific. So an example of how this might play out, I wish that I had used the example Aaron Mead, who Dr. Chakrabarti referenced, the specificity of the way text functions in terms of theater of the roots is a fascinating example, but not prepared to speak on that one today. So instead, one of the relationships I've encountered is the Oriki performances in Nigeria. These are praise poems or praise names for individuals, for towns, for animals, for objects at times. And they have these praise names, and the poems are supposed to be absolutely stable text. They're passed down orally, but they're not supposed to change. And they're supposed to refer to the unchanging nature of the humans or towns or whatever involved. But they are recognized, there's a recognition that the text have shifted over time. And the text have shifted over time because the people need to be reminded of who they are truly and eternally who they are, but somehow they've deviated from that. So both the eternal unchanging text and the eternal unchanging person have changed. And this is fully recognized. I'm not blowing a hole in some tradition. This is part of the tradition that you have to at once hold in your mind, that people are fluid and unchanging, and that text is fluid and unchanging, and that somehow the text can come in and intersect with this both fluid and unchanging person to do something in that context. And in order to begin to understand that tangle, you have to take so many steps back from the terms and the way we understand them. So my answer to your question is, I can't answer that question in absence of a specific context.
Thank you so much, sir. Definitely the question, it actually, your answer, it actually talks about this very dynamic and this complex relationship between text and performance and ritual and the amalgamation of it all. Thank you, sir. My next question is to Dr. Sukanya Chakrabarti. Ma'am, how might we investigate the senses in which the various tangible aspects of theatre create dynamic atmospheres in performance and theatre in both sensuous and aesthetic ways?
Yeah, that's a very beautiful question, actually. Thank you for that. I feel like the main difference that a performance, or like the main layer that it takes on when jumping from the page to the stage, is the sensorial aspects, right? Like, kind of changing from a text to a performance. I feel like it's just that sensorial activation, both by the performers, but also by the space and also by the presence of the spectators. I feel like definitely there is a meaning making happening in kind of creating the relationship of the performers, not just with the text, but the relationship of the performers amongst themselves, but relationship of the performers with the spectators, the relationship of the spectators amongst themselves, and this kind of interaction. So there is a lot of these sites of meaning making happening simultaneously through exchange of sensorial experiences. And I feel like again, that is not very new in terms of theater as a device of meaning making. But like when we add the additional layer of an outside performance, which is non-proscenium, which is not controlled by a black box theater, not controlled by other controlling methods, right, like seating arrangements, or just having the lights off. And so there is a certain kind of poetic release, I feel like, when there is this kind of open field or open railway station or a bus depot, which again transitions from being just theater studies to performance studies, right? Like, because it kind of really jumps off from just a stage to the space as a whole, like and the accidental and magical discoveries that the actors and the performers make along the way, through these different kinds of interactions with the space, with the periphery, with accidental entrances and exits, like a stray dog coming and barking in the space of, and like so I feel like the meaning that is generated there is far more powerful in terms of activating the spectator than putting them in a controlled environment and asking them to just consume what is being fed to them. Like, it also kind of departs from that consumer mentality where one is a participant, not necessarily a consumer. One is equally complicit in that meaning making process. So yeah.
Thank you so much, ma'am, for this brilliant answer. So, with this, we now come to the end of today's session. I would once again like to say that we are calling for submissions of stories, essays, and poems, and for project architecture and submission guidelines. Please visit www.tellmeyourstory.biz. I extend my heartfelt thank you to Dr. Anita Singh, Dr. Glenn Odom, and Dr. Sukanya Chakrabarti for this wonderful and remarkable session. Thank you so much for joining us.